You stand with the heel of your hand against a wooden table scarred by 100 harvests, and the air is thick with smoke and salt and the sweet fog of simmering apples. You can feel the grain of the board bite into your palm. You can taste a memory of last summer on your tongue. And somewhere beyond the low roof, the wind carries the thin metallic tang of the sea. It is the year when winter breathes early, in a village that sits between river and marsh, and there is no humming machine keeping meat cold, no electric comfort to buy time. Food is a question of work and weather, of craft and ritual, and sometimes of luck. Without preservation, a winter is not a season, it is a countdown. Farmers and cooks learn to turn time itself into an ingredient, to braid patience with technique so that a family could be fed through moons that knew how to steal freshness. The villagers became alchemists of survival, using smoke and salt and dark cellars to hold summer like a coin against famine. Stay with me, and you will learn the small, ancient tricks that kept communities alive for years, the touch and smell and sound that were recipes in themselves. Dim your light, breathe in, and step with me into a story where a jar, a pit, and a handful of salt could mean the difference between feast and empty bowls. Whole towns rose and fell on these practices, and some of their recipes survive, like slow-burning embers of memory. Prepare yourself. What looks like a simple cure is actually a pact made with seasons. In the morning, the village wakes slow. Chickens make clumsy declarations, a cartwheel groans as it turns, and someone at the tannery hammers leather until the stroke finds a steady heartbeat. You can see smoke twitching from thatch, gray ribbons rising and brushing the cold sky. The market road is a ribbon of mud and straw, where old women balance baskets and boys trade sticks of willow for crusts of bread. In the center, a well has a rope worn thin by many hands. Names float across this scene like small stones in a pond. Marta the baker wipes her flour-flecked hands on her apron and smiles with the kind of stubborn warmth that people rely on. Tomas, the blacksmith, keeps his temper like iron in the forge and mends heavy tools between making small charms for protection. Brother Elias at the monastery keeps late ledgers of grain and an even later jar of experimental pickles. Ain, the herb woman, sells vinegar boiled down from bruised apple pomace. Jorit, the boatman, moves salt inland with a secret grin. Greta knits and tells tales that make children brave. Old man Hal counts moons and remembers droughts. Rinaldo, the traveling merchant, arrives with spices and stories from the coast. The villagers speak with a shared air of practicality. They do not romanticize.
Hunger. They name it because naming allows them to measure and fight it. Houses breathe on the inside, the smell of fresh-baked rye, the wet animal smell of a cellar where root vegetables sleep, and the crisp, metallic salt that lingers on hands that have touched seawater. Sound matters here. The first pop of a jar releasing its seal can silence a room. A fire that spits and goes quiet tells those who listen that a smoke cure is entering patience. Routine threads the community. Men mend nets at dusk, women hang strings of garlic and sprigs of thyme and tie them to beams. Children learn to pound herbs into pastes that keep flies at bay. These routines are ritual and technique braided together. The problem arrives like a forecast. Meat spoils faster than bellies can grow hungry. Milk turns in a week in warm weather, and summer bread goes stale in the day when the air is humid. For peasants, the enemy is not only time, but insects, rodents, and the invisible work of microbes. Without preservation, every harvest risks becoming a single meal. From small failures come hunger, and from hunger come desperation that reshapes a life. So solutions were not invented by one person. They are the result of many hands and many slow failures learned the hard way. The first and oldest answer is salt. Salt works by drawing water out of flesh and microbes until they can no longer thrive. You see it on wedges of fish drying in the sun, on slabs of pork rubbed and packed into barrels, on the pale crystals that line cellars like snow. Drying is another. Sun and wind can suck moisture out of fish and herbs, leaving texture and concentrated flavor. Smoke moves beyond flavor into preservation. The heat and chemicals in smoke form a skin, a barrier, and the smell acts as an antiseptic that confuses decomposers. Then there is fermentation, a controlled surrender to microbes that turns milk into cheese and cabbage into something that will outlast the field. Vinegar, brine, curing, waxing, sealing with fat and wax and honey, burying food in cool earth, the careful layering in a chest with ash between layers to keep pests away. Each practice answers a specific threat. Meat packed in salt to keep maggots away, milk turned to cheese to keep lactic bacteria from letting rot have its way, fruits simmered into syrup and sealed to deny molds the room to grow. How did peasants know which to use? They learned from observation and memory, and in small household experiments that became family law. They used ingredients that were at hand. Salt came from the edge of the world when the village had traders. Where salt was scarce, fermentation flourished. In every case, the object was the same. The aim was to make food stable for time. Listen to a micro scene at the edge of the smokehouse where Marta teaches a younger woman how to cure.
A ham. Marta says, "Feel the meat. It should be cool, dense, and just a little springy." The woman answers, "The salt is rough on my fingers." Marta replies, "You need to press it in. Work the grain with your palm. The salt must meet every surface." She asks, "How long will it stay?" Marta answers, "Months if you do it right. Start with a week in salt, then hang it in smoke for a month and it will keep through the cold." The woman pauses and asks, "What wood?" Marta says, "Oak for depth, apple for sweetness, never pine unless you want resin on your tongue." The woman laughs, "I will not tell my husband pine has a taste to it." They touch the meat together, sharing the weight of responsibility. This exchange is a small ritual and a transfer of authority. Skills pass this way. Dialogues like this keep knowledge alive. Across the village, similar exchanges happen at doorways and during chores. In the cellar, a different conversation happens when Brother Elias shows a novice how to set whey for cheese. "The curds must be set gently," he says. "Stir as the monks taught you, not as a churn." The novice answers, "Why not more heat? It saves time." Elias counters, "Heat breaks the texture. Patience is the technology here." This gentle argument is an apprenticeship in patience. At roughly this point, consider the sensation of the scene. If the description brings a memory of an elder stirring a pot in a dim kitchen, or the salt on your lip when you last ate something cured, pause and tell us about it in the comments. If the smell of smoke and applewood took you back to a porch where a grandmother hung meat to dry, write a short note in the comments with your location and the technique your family used. Tell us one item and how they would store it. That simple sharing turns this channel into a living archive. I will read some of these stories and, with your permission, bring a few of them into future episodes, where we can examine the jars and methods you grew up with. The goal is not to judge, but to learn and connect old practices to new lives. Now let us return to the meat and salt and the small tools that keep time at bay. The detailed techniques are where the craft becomes visible. Salting begins with the right crystal. Sea salt in coarse flakes is forgiving. The process is simple in outline and exact in practice. First, wash and pat dry the cut. Sprinkle a layer of salt, then press it in so it forms a crust. Some recipes add sugar or spices to balance and feed cultures in a controlled way. Pack the meat in a barrel or crock layered with salt, and press with a weight. Over days, the salt draws moisture out, creating a concentrated brine that bathes the flesh. Timing matters. Too brief, and the center will still be vulnerable. Too long, and the meat will overcure and harden. The next step is rinsing and drying. A final hang in a smokehouse will complete the cure, adding phenolic compounds that slow spoilage and grant aroma. The language of smoke is precise. You choose wood like a composer chooses notes. Alder and fruit woods give light sweetness. Oak gives lasting depth. The smokehouse must breathe but not blaze. A slow smolder produces tar and creosote. You watch the color change, the way fat beads beneath the skin, and you learn to trust sight, smell, and touch. The technical core is not mysterious.
The physics is osmosis, the chemistry is salt binding water and denaturing proteins, the biology is preventing microbes from finding a hospitable niche. That description is short and dry in textbooks. In practice, it is hands pressing and waiting, like religion and like recipe. Let us pause here for an instructional moment where method meets story. Imagine the brine: water, 10% salt by weight, sometimes a handful of herbs and crushed peppercorns. Meat is submerged for days depending on thickness. The brining process keeps tissues plump and flavorful because salt in low concentrations allows water to move into cells before tightening them. You can taste a note of sea in a brined ham that has been baked later, a living fossil of the water it was held in. A procedure might take 3 days for a small joint and a week for a bigger piece. Simple measurements and patient attention are the difference between success and a ruined winter. Backstory shapes the hands that do this work. The central protagonist in our thread is Marta, woman of the oven and smoke. She was a child of drought. Her father lost 2 seasons to a pest that found the stored grain because the family had lacked a cellar deep enough and the right method to dry the harvest. Marta remembers the way her mother clenched a wooden spoon as if it could beat the hunger away. At 12, she apprenticed with a traveling butcher who taught her salting and with a monk who taught her whey curdling. By 20, she had a small smokehouse built against her house. She learned the economy of sharing. When Marta was 25, a fever took her brother, and for a year, the family subsisted on a single cured ham over winter. That scarcity defined her hands. She swore then to always pay forward knowledge. Now, in her 40s, she carries the fatigue of many seasons and the steady hope of a woman who knows how to translate sunlight and salt into food. The memory of loss threads through each instruction she gives. She holds a jar from her childhood that still smells faintly of juniper and warmth and shows it to those she teaches as proof that time can be held. Her story is ordinary and it is heroic in its persistence. You feel the callus at her thumb from lifting weights. You hear the steady metronome of her breath when she counts a curing day. You see in her eyes the ledger of seasons and recipes. Secondary characters orbit Marta and populate the scenes with texture. Tomas the blacksmith will lend a barrel hoop and tell you why iron oxidizes near brine. Brother Elias keeps monk notes and swears by rennet from a specific flock, while Ain the herb woman argues for fermenting with a specific wild yeast from apple skins. Jorit the boatman brings in salt and tells his son, salt is the village currency that cannot be bagged. Greta will hum and stitch labels onto cloth covers for jars so children know which month they were sealed. Old man Hal counts days by the silvering of his hair, and Ronaldo the merchant will haggle and introduce pepper that makes a brine giddy. These 8 individuals make the market and the kitchen feel like a living machine. They are named because communal preservation is not an act of solitary heroism, but a distributed craft. Tension arrives in the cold months when a shipment of salt is delayed and a storm cuts off the inland road. The first moment is quiet, a tightening that becomes audible in the clink of coins as people recalculate rations. In the smokehouse, Marta runs through options. She can sweet cure more pork, she can move root vegetables into deeper pits, or she can barter cheese for a ladle of the last salt. The stakes are not rhetorical. If salt does not reach them, meat will be eaten fresh, and a family will exhaust the buffer that keeps it alive. The conflict reveals social bonds. Some will hoard, some will share, and social pressure will decide which. A heated meeting in the square follows. Tomas argues, we must save the salt for true emergency. Ronaldo retorts, if you do not trade, my goods rot, and the merchant root dies. Brother Elias speaks in ledger tones. Grain will support the village longer than cured meat if we ration right. This is a negotiation that lasts a night. Decisions are not swift, but they are decisive. The outcome shapes who eats and who learns to go hungry. Moments of tension like the storm have weight. One such scene stretches as Marta stands over a barrel, testing the brine with a finger to see if it reads right. She thinks of the fever that took her brother. Her hand trembles and memories arrive uninvited. She remembers a morning when her family had only stale porridge, and she had traded a ring for a sack of barley. That memory sharpens her decision. She chooses to break her own reserve and trade cured pieces for the rest of the village. The choice costs her comfort, but cements communal trust. This internal conflict and choice is raw and fits a longer cadence. It is a slow pressure cooker of memory and duty, culminating.
The tenderness of that decision is paid back across seasons in the hands of others helping mend her roof. Fermentation is another realm, and it invites us into sound and smell. In the dim cool of a cellar, you hear the soft pop and sigh of a jar releasing gas. The air tastes of earth and a brightness like lemon. Monks learn to make vinegar by leaving wine to become tart, and villagers use that acid to pickle and preserve. Fermenting vegetables is an act of harnessing living microbes that you invite to work for you. Salt concentrations are precise. Too much and the bacteria you want will not thrive. Too little and the wrong players move in. The process makes noise. Bubbles rise like tiny glass bells. Fabrics at the jar mouth dampen and smell of cucumber and must. The technical description becomes story when Brother Elias and a novice argue at a vat. "How do you know the culture is right?" the novice asks. Elias replies, "You smell, you see the foam. Trust the eyes and nose and a ledger from the old abbey that lists months and pinch measures." The novice counters, "It is dangerous to trust sense alone." Elias smiles, "True, but our ancestors did not have refractometers. They had faith and practice." The humor leavens the exactness. For a practical explanation, set cabbage with salt at 2% by weight. Pound it to release juices. Pack it into a jar so that liquid covers the leaves. Leave it at a cool, stable temperature and check for scum to skim. Over weeks, lactic bacteria turn sugars into acid. The result is a stable food that sings with tartness and keeps for months under cloth. Drying and cellars are architecture for preservation. A celario is a cool, dark room or underground chamber lined so that air can move but not heat. The design matters. Roots are layered in straw, meat hung from beams, and jars placed on shelves away from floors where rodents prowl. That architecture is not neutral. It is a technology that mediates seasons. Thatch roofs, packed earth floors, and thatch-insulated walls work together with the mass of cool earth to create a steady climate. There are rituals attendant to storage. You bless the main chest before winter. You smudge smoke into corners to ward off pests. You knot cloth on jars to signal who packed them. Superstitions have an ecological function. A charm pinned to a barrel keeps mice at bay by altering the attention of people and thereby the frequency of checking. You may laugh at a ritual, but notice how often ritual and practical inspection arrive together. A weekly inspection prevents rot. Markets translate preservation into power. Grain stored in granaries becomes leverage. Salt trade routes determine wealth. If you imagine a highway of clay and mud where carts creak and customs officers tally duties, you quickly see how preservation was also politics. Ronaldo the merchant
Can demand tolls, and the village pays in kind or in favors. Names matter here because one shipment can change a mayoral election or a feast day. Tomas once refused to repair a road until taxes were lowered, and that small strike forced conversation between village elders and tax collectors. In town, you meet merchants from the coast who show silvery fish flayed and salted on benches, and you see representatives of wealthy towns who store salt in cubic measures in warehouses. Preservation becomes currency and salt its mint. There are stories of petty wars where access to salt ensured victory because soldiers needed preserved rations. That macro view connects the work of one household to the grand sweep of history. How do these old methods compare to modern technology? A refrigerator is a machine that steals heat and keeps water frozen as a delay tactic. It is a certain kind of magic. But refrigeration depends on electricity, supply lines, and manufacturing. Where these systems fail you, you return to smoke and salt. Ancient methods are low energy and locally repairable.
They do not require modern infrastructure, and they scale differently. A smokehouse can be built from scavenged wood. A cellar is a hole with knowledge applied. The old ways teach resilience. They are not better in every dimension. They are slower, sometimes salt-heavy, and not suited to every crop. But they offer a distributed model of food security. Think of an ice house in Persia, or a yakchal, an ancient evaporative cold store. These are analogs of modern refrigeration built with local materials and deep knowledge of physics. We return now to dialogue that shows how skill is transmitted beyond a single house. On a damp afternoon in the market, Marta explains to Eileen how to test a brine. Eileen asks, how salty should the water taste? Marta replies, less than the sea, more than a soup. If it makes your mouth pucker and not sting, that is where you want it. Eileen says, my hands are soft from herbs, I do not have the calluses. Marta laughs, soft hands learn. Press here and feel the way the salt molds. You will know. Jorit interjects, and do not forget to lay oak chips under the meat. Smoke is not a single flavor, it is a map. Ronaldo adds, when I came from the coast, I saw a curing smoked on kelp. The taste was like the ocean itself. Old man Hal mumbles, kelp is fine, but flies disagree. The group laughs and argues, teaching in fragments, in little stories. That exchange is more instructive than a manual because it sets values and alternatives. There are moments of crisis and memory that shape a community. A drought year when the river retreated taught them to value fermentation for grain and to make syrup from surplus apples. A plague of weevils spread through a poor storage, forcing innovation in sealing jars with wax and pitch to deny insects access. These innovations
meet superstition and science. Monks recorded one technique in a ledger that became scripture for neighbors. That ledger reads like a recipe and a contract. It says to wash grain 3 times, to dry it in a sunroom that faces south, and to sprinkle ash between layers. The ash deters insects. It seems odd, but it works. The science is simple and the folk wisdom is precise. Here is a technical aside for sealing jars. You heat beeswax and dip the lip of a jar to make a thin, waterproof coat. For heavier sealing, a mix of rendered fat and beeswax poured hot around the rim and pressed with a cloth forms a barrier. This is thermal sealing and takes minutes, but the jar needs cool storage afterwards. For wax sealing, you must avoid overheating sugars that might burn. This is hands-on, rapid work that requires rhythm and care. Now, a longer personal tension arrives. The village faces a moral decision when a neighboring hamlet runs out of grain. They send envoys asking for seed and salt. The debate in the square is long. Tomas says, if we give away our stock, the next harvest we might have less to trade. Greta replies, if we do not help them, we become the kind of people that hoard and forget how to share. Brother Elias stands and says in a voice that sounds like a bell, we are the archipelago of human need. A tide that takes one house will eventually take another if we do not act. The village votes to share. This is the moment where preservation is also an ethic. Choices are not only technical, they are moral. The final block closes with a practical epilogue that follows time in months. 1 month later, the new brine is settled and jars have their cloth caps. You walk the village and find shelves labeled with names and dates. The smell is stable. People check, they tap, they smell and nod. A child gets sick in January, but a pot of preserved stew serves and the fever breaks with warm nourishment. The social ledger is reinforced. 3 months in, the dispute over the salt shipment is forgotten, as the shared stores yield steady meals. Ronaldo sends word that a new route will open in spring, and in the meantime, the village rotates preserves to avoid wear. The community is not triumphant, but pragmatic. 6 months later, the seasons shift and the smokehouse is almost emptied. The jars that remain are trophies of patience. Marta sits with Greta in late spring, and they open a small pot sealed since the previous autumn. There is a brief pop, a warm tide of scent, and a shared silence. The food is not the same as fresh summer fruit, but the flavor is layered and deep. They eat and speak quietly.
The lessons have embedded themselves in young hands. Children know where to find wax and how to tie a cloth.
And what was learned is not only technique, but a philosophy of attention. Salt, smoke, and time are not brute tools, but partners. Preservation teaches listening to weather and seasons and to the bodies of food. It teaches that small acts repeated can become security. It teaches that knowledge moves by exchange. If this episode leaves one practical impulse, then it is this: start small. Dry some herbs on a windowsill. Try a brine with a single joint. Seal a jar with wax and watch and record what happens. You are joining a chain that stretches across centuries. It is not nostalgia to learn these things. It is a wise redundancy, a skill to carry into uncertain times. If you enjoyed this deep walk through old techniques and you like bridging science and story, consider subscribing. I will bring more episodes where we unpeel jars and the histories stuck to their rims. Share this with someone who keeps family recipes in their head. Tell a neighbor a small practice tonight and ask them to tell you the reason they do it. Memory and method are better when shared. Each scene we walked had hands at work and names that returned like refrain. Marta, Tomas, Brother Elias, Ein, Jorrit, Greta, Old Man Hall, and Ronaldo are not simply characters. They are archetypes of a communal economy of preservation. The village is a laboratory where technique meets faith. The rituals are sometimes practical, sometimes superstitious, and often both. The broad sweep of history shows salt as a trade good that altered maps and defined power. But at the level of a family, salt is intimate and physical, a crystal you can feel and trust. Preservation is a human-scale science. 1 month after our first scene, the cellar cools and the first jars show signs of stability. A pot of meat that had been brined and smoked gives a steady warmth to the table, and the community gathers. A small child learns to accept the tartness of pickled cabbage. Conversations are softer and confidence grows. 3 months in, the barter network stabilizes. Ronaldo is able to trade for a new sale, and the village pays with cheese and salted fish. Social credit increases. New apprentices are taken on. 6 months later, when spring colors return and the first tender shoots show, the preserved foods that kept bodies fat now take on a different life as seasoning. A little preserved onion becomes a luxury when mixed with fresh greens. The epilogue is not a tidy moral, but a record of resilience. The jars that sealed the winter become tokens of community memory. They hold flavor and story. The final note is this: every sealed pot is a pledge that a season can be kept and distributed. Each jar that opens with a soft sigh carries the past into a present mouth. If you learn something useful here, try one small preservation in your kitchen and write what happened. Share a short note about your town in the technique that rests in your family. This practice will turn a solitary recipe into a shared archive. Thank you for sitting with smoke and salt and time. Keep your hands busy, your senses open, and your lids tight.